Well, hello, friends. Paul Yeager with you. This is the MTOM Show podcast, a production of Iowa PBS and the Market to Market to Market to Market to Market program, which you see all over in our studios here in Iowa. We're going to talk about cattle across the country today. Our friend Derrell Peel at Oklahoma State University, he's an extension specialist in livestock. We had a great chat with him last year. Many of you caught that. We're going to test his knowledge about the most recent cattle inventory report. There was one headline that was easy to see, and that's some low numbers since the 1950s. Here's the thing. Mr. Peel has some, I won't say breaking news, but more news in that same vein for the coming year. Year two, and maybe even year three. We're going to get into what's going on the farm, in the feedlot, at the packer door, and at the grocery store. We'll also talk about the restaurant and how that consumer factors into all of this discussion about the livestock market. If you have any feedback about the program or an idea, I'd love to hear from you. It's paul.yeager@iowapbs.org. Now, let's talk livestock. What's the travel season like this year? You been busy?
I just got back about an hour and a half ago from Atlanta. I've been on the road for the last week.
What are people asking you?
And so, well, I haven't done, I've done a lot of media stuff, but I haven't actually done any producer meetings since this report came out. I've written a couple of things and done a bunch of media stuff, but, producers are generally very, very happy with the market we're in. They're kind of excited, but they're still proceeding with caution. Is my way of interpreting it. We certainly didn't see any heifer retention last year, and we have to wait and see what happens this year. I think they're ready. I think they're thinking about it. I think they're getting closer to doing it, but it's been a slow process to get their expectations to a point where they really wanted to jump off and do that in a big way.
Well, let's look at it this way. What was your headline of that cattle inventory report?
Well, no big surprises. I mean, the report actually came in pretty close to expectations. So, we've gotten smaller over the last year coming into this year, small enough that in many cases we're setting, decades long comparisons now on some of these inventory categories. The only surprise, if you will, in the report was really some of the revisions that USDA made to last year's numbers. Specifically the replacement heifer category. Those were big revisions, but that happens as more information comes in. So again, not a surprise that we would get revisions, but the size of the revisions was a little bit bigger than you would normally expect.
A year ago at this time when we talked, the story was, I still categorize it as a weather story. Now, again, when you talk about revisions, has that revised how we talk about the 22 story and looking at it in 23 and now here in early 24?
I don't think it really does. I mean, we go back and it basically says that we were, getting tighter faster than we realized and than the data said. But in some ways, I suppose a little bit bigger perspective on it is that maybe the revisions kind of confirm what we sort of felt like was happening. Again, sometimes there is a little catch up on the data to, when things are changing fast, sometimes the data takes a little while to catch up.
I guess I've never asked this, but do you know the makings of how revisions happen? I mean, is it different than what happens in grains?
I don't know that I know the details, so I wouldn't want to speculate on that, in terms of, exactly how that happens. I'm not really sure relative to how their sampling frame changes or whatever. So, yeah.
I just curious. You just brought it up. I'm like, you know what? I've never asked. I should ask somebody.
Yeah. Well, I could ask too in more detail. I just never have. So
I may have to do that. I mean, because we always hear about it in grain reports and market analysts, they come on and they like, well, we revised this and it happens with, say, unemployment. I mean, those revisions happen. They say we moved this month and the gross domestic product, there's revisions there. So I guess in a way it's everybody trying to just get things right.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, again, it's a statistical process, and sometimes you just get additional information that you need to go back and kind of reset the boundaries here, and then make your new comparisons.
I was looking at a chart before we started talking, and it's a web and flow, but the biggest thing is it still keeps trending smaller and smaller. Have we hit peak cattle inventory in the United States, do you think?
Oh, we hit the peak inventory in the mid 1970s. If you look at that chart, we peaked all time records for cattle inventory for the beef cow herd, whatever, in the mid 1970s. And then, we got smaller for a lot smaller, or smaller fairly quickly, I should say, for about 15 years after that. And then since then, in my mind, we've been trying to kind of stabilize. We're still cyclical, so we still have ups and downs in the numbers, but as a trend, I think the industry kind of reached what could be a stable size, but we've had a hard time. We've had 2 decades in a row where drought has emphasized the lows, taking us lower than we needed to be and wanted to be, and so it's been a challenge to sort of maintain that stability, going forward. Now I still think I don't think we got too big in this last cattle cycle, with around 32 million beef cows. In fact, when we first sort of peaked out, I described it as a plateau because the economics, I thought, was going to be a very sideways kind of a movement, maybe a slight liquidation. And that's sort of what happened from 2019 to 2020. And then by the time we got into 2021, we were starting to see some drought issues take a hold. Certainly 22 and 23 were driven by the drought. So we had a fairly pronounced liquidation. So sort of the timing kind of fit in with the cattle cycle, but really exaggerated it to the downside. And this time has taken us lower even than the one 10 years ago.
Yeah, you look at the dips in that same 10 chart. Yeah, it is 2013 and 1989. I mean, yes, it all lines up with those big drought cycles that we've had. So, is it only weather that lowers our herd size? Is that still the biggest factor?
I think weather is the primary reason why we got this low. Again, I don't think we intended to get this low. I don't think the economics would have taken us this low from the 2019 peak. But having gotten there, now I think there's a number of factors at play. One of which is still continuing weather issues and potential weather issues. But I think there's some other factors at play now that will have a lot to do with uh, how fast we rebuild, probably more than anything. I don't think there's a question that we will rebuild at some point. I don't think there's much of a question that we will rebuild, back to significant levels. I've heard a few people say, well, we're just never going to go back. I don't think that's true. I think this industry has plenty of market potential to be. Again, I don't think we got too big in 2019. So I think that's still a reasonable target, somewhere in that neighborhood. But the process we're going to get there this time is going to be a lot different than what happened from 2014 to 2019.
In what way?
The difference, even though it was both drought driven, so it was drought that took us low in 20, to the low in 2014's. Drought has taken us now to what may be the low. It's not clear it is the low yet. But the drought in 2011, 12, and 13 was very, very severe, but in a specific region, primarily Oklahoma and Texas and immediately surrounding areas. Lots of the rest of the industry kind of continued with business as usual through that time period. And one of the things that came out of that was that we maintained and actually started building a bit of a heifer pipeline before we started herd expansion in 2014. This time, we have not done that because the drought has been much more widespread. It's moved around to different regions. It's affected so many more producers over the last 2 to 3 years. We have continued to liquidate females, so we're in a much bigger hole now, in terms of where we start from to try to rebuild. It's going to be a much slower process. I think it's going to take significantly longer, even once we decide we want to do it. And it's not clear that producers are quite there yet. but I think they're getting there. I really expect, unless weather jumps up is a big factor again here in 2024. I think producers are probably ready to start that process, but it's inevitably going to be a slower process.
Well, you answered my question ahead of me even asking this next one about regions, because I was curious. Again, last year we talked about your region, Oklahoma, Texas, dry. Right now, where I'm at, dry, but we're not near the cattle producing area that you are. So, when you say it's more widespread, that is interesting to me, because it then makes it seem like either it's super pronounced everywhere and really bad in the areas that could get impacted the most, or is it just there's just so many numbers that the math has to work out that reduction is smaller because of the weather issue in a wider area.
Yeah, if you look at the drought, I mean, it really started in 2020, and that, the first year of the drought was really kind of southern Rocky Mountains, southern part of Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and they were severely impacted. Colorado had a big decrease in beef cow numbers that year, but they're not big enough to really change the national numbers. So it didn't show up so much till 2021, and the drought was much worse in the northern plains. So it was primarily the Dakotas, eastern Montana, Wyoming. And then it sort of moved out of that area, and they improved quite a bit in 2022, moved farther south into the central and southern plains in 2022. In 2023, it got worse down in Texas again. Oklahoma actually had a pretty good year in 2023, but we were kind of an island in a sea of drought in 2023. And Kansas continued and still continues to have dry areas. It got worse in Missouri in 2023. And then late in the year, of course, well, it moved back up into the Midwest somewhat, but it also moved into the Delta and Gulf Coast region for a while. Now, recently, they've gotten a lot of rain. So I think, they've gotten some improvement. But the point is, everybody's kind of had their turn in the grinder here, and they've been forced to do some things, make some tough decisions, and incurred a lot of both sort of physical pain in terms of the herd and the resource issues, as well as the financial issues that go along with trying to survive a drought. And so I think it's been a much more broad-based kind of an impact cumulatively over these last 3 years or so.
Or let's play conspiracy theorist. We have fewer feeders, fewer operations who are bigger, therefore maybe a little more flexible in how they can shift from one state to another and weather a storm. Is that a possibility?
I don't think that's much of the story. We as we've moved tighter, we've managed to hold feedlot inventories high, kind of against gravity. We've sort of been defying gravity for about the last 3 years. And we've done that, with a couple of ways. The biggest one, of course, is that we've continued to place a lot of heifers and keep feedlot inventories. Feedlots obviously are volume-based businesses. They want to run that feed mill. Packers are volume businesses. They need to run as close to capacity as they can. Both of them are trying to manage costs more than anything. And again, we've been able to do it. The drought kind of aided and abetted that process by forcing, in many cases, people to market feeder cattle sooner rather than later. So they got into the feedlot a little quicker. We pulled cattle forward a little bit. And so in some cases, we pulled them in at somewhat lighter weights, which means they can stay in the feedlot a lot longer. And so, feedlots need to be full feeding cattle, but it doesn't matter whether they're turning them over very fast. And so, and in fact, what we've continued to see is the days on feed on average have gone up. The turnover rates have gone down. So we're not necessarily producing more beef. And that was certainly true beginning in 2023. But it's the dynamics of how those inventories play out. Now, I say all that to say that you can chase that thing as far as, for a while, but at some point in time, you run out of runway. And I think it's been slower to come down than I thought, but I really think in the next few months, we will see these feedlot inventories tighten up dramatically because we just don't have the cattle. The feeder supply really reflects that now. And of course, the clincher will be when we do start retaining heifers. Then we won't be placing them in the feedlots. And so a tight cattle supply is going to get severely tight for a couple of year period when we start retaining heifers. to try to expand the herd. And we haven't really gotten into that yet, but it's coming.
One side of the ledger, that mill can get some cheaper corn right now.
Yeah.
Does
Um,
that complicate matters?
well, it's as we go forward, to back up just a little bit, 2023 was a pretty good year for cattle feeders because we got to record high fed cattle prices, frankly, faster than I expected. I'm not sure why the fed cattle kind of led feeder cattle in that process, but they did. And so feedlots, really had pretty good returns because they got to sell sort of record fed cattle prices at 2022 feeder cattle prices for the most part. And even though cost of gain was high, they did pretty well. Going forward, they are going to get some breaks on cost of gain. That will help, and certainly will provide them with more incentive to try to find things to feed. But the numbers are going to get tighter. They're going to have a hard time finding numbers of feeder cattle of any kind, and they're going to be very, very expensive when they do find them. So I think they're going to face a lot more challenges with their margins going forward, like all of the margin industries above the cow-calf level.
I've been avoiding this word for the majority of the conversation. I only had one word written down, and that was bubble. Are you concerned at all for those folks that you just talked about, that they're the ones who have bought the feeder? They've bought that animal at the high.
Well, no, they haven't bought it at the high because we're nowhere near the highs yet. Again, if you look at the high prices we had in 2014 and 15, those high prices led by calves and feeder cattle, as happens in this kind of a situation. But those happened a year to a year and a half into herd expansion. Again, that's the product of a tight supply getting a lot tighter when you start pulling heifers out of the feeder cattle mix. And so that's all ahead of us yet. We've gotten to nearly record high prices just in anticipation of that. So where we are now is not the peak that we saw in 2014. It's about a third of the way up the left shoulder of that thing. And so, we've got a long ways to go here. But all of that said, in this kind of a market, again, the market's focus right now is on the cow-calf sector. We need more cows. We've liquidated too far relative to the market's potential. The market's trying to provide incentives. So it's going to raise those calf prices, and then the whole constellation of feeder cattle up through fed cattle and so on goes up. But the input side of those margin operations above the cow-calf level are going to go up faster and probably proportionately more than the output price is. And so every one of those margin operations in general is going to feel a squeeze. And that's going to become much more apparent for the feedlots. Every turn of cattle for the next 2+ years is going to be increasingly challenging for them because the replacement cost, the incoming cost, once they sell cattle out, is going to look pretty daunting, I think, as we go forward. And the numbers won't be good, so they won't be operating anywhere close to capacity, and they're going to have some cost inefficiencies that go along with that.
Yeah, is there a size of producer that's more susceptible in that cycle that you just talked about?
Well, I'm not sure. The big guys need the most cattle, and they're the ones that got that way because of cost efficiencies. So, in some sense, when the numbers aren't there, they can potentially be the first ones to sort of feel the pain. Now, that said, small guys may not have the easy advantage to find cattle. They're probably operating in a little different market space, if you will, a little bit smaller circle. So I don't know that it's going to make a lot of difference. Like everybody's going to face a lot of challenges, maybe in slightly different ways.
What about the consumer? Because at what point does that consumer look at the meat counter and go, something else?
Well, you know what? Beef is already at record levels. There's a ton of pork and poultry out there, and consumers aren't turning to it. And as long as that's true, now it could change, but we've been through a lot the last couple of years. We've continued to watch demand, and I will continue to watch it, concerned about that potential. But we just don't see any indication that fundamentally consumer demand is weakening at all. And you know as well as I do, you can go to any steakhouse in town on Thursday night, and you're going to wait in line for an hour. And so it still continues to look pretty good at that point. Now we're producing less beef. Beef production had an all-time peak in 2022 as a result of liquidation. So that's a non-sustainable way to peak out beef production because we were eating inventory. You can't do that consistently. And so 2023, we started to see beef production fall, dropped about 4.6% or something like that in 2023. We're looking for another 5% decrease in 2024 and another decrease yet of some magnitude in 2025 at least. So all of that said, we're, some consumers are not going to eat as much beef because there isn't going to be as much beef. And so, some people are going to see that and say, well, that means demand is fading. In an economist world, that's not a loss of demand. That's a change in the quantity available, right? And in the process, when supplies get tighter, the market generally rations a smaller supply with higher prices, and that's what I expect to happen. So, I think we'll see somewhat higher. Now, again, I said earlier that at every level of the market, all the way to the consumer level, prices won't go up as fast or proportionately as much as the layers below them. So, I think everybody, and that means that ultimately probably retailers will feel some squeeze. I suspect that retail prices, they will go higher, but I don't think they'll go higher proportionally as much as probably boxed beef will at some point. Boxed beef won't go up as much as fed cattle do. So packers will get squeezed. They're already getting squeezed. Everybody's going to get a piece of this squeeze going forward. But the end result is that there's going to be less beef and it's going to cost more for the foreseeable future.
Okay, give me the Packer story in this. You did just kind of, their margins were good, then they weren't. What do you see them here in 24? You did kind of just gloss it quick.
Well, yeah, same story, really. They're a margin operation. They're a volume-based business. They're going to have trouble with both of those things going forward. The supplies aren't there, and again, fed cattle prices are going to squeeze them relatively more. Even though boxed beef will adjust, it will go up at some point. But the dynamics of those supply changes take time to work through the market, and so I think the Packers, to the extent that I have a little interaction with them, they know what's coming. They're prepared for it. They don't like it, but they can't do anything about it. And they're prepared to kind of hunker down and do the best they can for the next 2+ years.
At some point, when the consumer has to pay, or it's believed that someone's making way more money than they should, Congress gets involved, or your elected official. Where do you anticipate they might sniff around this cycle?
Well, I suppose if there's going to be some of that, I try to stay out of politics. I can't figure out cattle markets, let alone politics. But there is that tendency. If it happens this time, it'll probably happen in that consumer space. I would suspect as much as anywhere. There's going to be some wailing and gnashing of teeth over continued high prices and limited supplies. Not that we're going to run out. In fact, one of the keys to not running out of beef and having actual disruptions in supplies and supply chains is to allow prices to adjust. That's what markets do more than anything, is make sure we don't run out of stuff. And if we let the market work, it will take care of that. When we yield to the temptation to start messing with it, that's when I get nervous that we're going to actually create some additional problems in the marketplace.
Yeah, you and me both get concerned about that. And yes, no, I'm not trying to get you to dip into politics, but we both know what we're talking about here. I mean, it happens. We still haven't had a resolution from the last investigation of cycles. No action. You couldn't get beef state producers from both parties together. Even in their own party couldn't get together. So I don't have a lot of faith that anything's going to come there. And I think what you just said is, like so many things, the market will work itself out.
The beef industry collectively, all the things we've talked about, these multiple layers, the time dynamics, the geographic dispersion of this industry, I have argued for years and years. I truly believe that the U.S. cattle and beef industry is the most complex set of markets on the planet. And I've always challenged people, come up with another industry anywhere that's more complex. And I haven't had anybody really come up with a better example. And I say all that to say that there's so many moving parts in this industry, and we rely on so many markets at so many different levels, that if you start messing with one of them, or a couple of them at a given level, the unintended consequences across the entire industry are just unfathomable, because you really can't anticipate what all's connected to what all else. I mean, it's just enormously complex. And so, markets do a remarkable job. Um, when you think about the fact that you can walk into any grocery store in the country any day of the year, and there's fresh meat in there that's probably not more than 2 or 3 weeks from having been processed, but the process that started building the supply for that piece of meat to be there started 2.5 years ago. It's absolutely amazing any of it works. And it speaks to the power of the marketplace to coordinate a tremendous amount of diverse actors and situations and market levels, and keep it all flowing. I think it's actually quite remarkable what happens when you look at that.
And that's why I always appreciate you being able to boil it down for simpletons like myself. That's always great, Derrell. Okay, but I'm going to ask you to do one more simpleton thing here at the end. A year from now, when we're talking, do you anticipate? I think earlier you said we're looking at a 2 to 3 year cycle on one thing, a couple of months on here, 6 months in there. I guess let's just we'll boil it down to three things. What are we looking at for inventory a year from now?
The very best that I could see happening, and that's assuming weather's not a continuing negative factor, and that we even have an interest or producer expectations that want to try to start some sort of expansion. The very best that I can come up with the numbers we have to work with today, is we would be lucky to hold it stable this year. If you look at, again, these heifer inventories, the USDA just came out with the beef replacement heifer numbers are the lowest since 1950. And they revised last year's number. So these last two, January, based on the revision a year ago, and this one, we've had 2 years now of heifer of less than 5 million beef replacement heifers in the country, and that's not happened since 1950. And if you look at, when you think about changes in the cow herd, we're going to slaughter some cows, but the question is how many. Beef cow slaughter would have to drop 20% or more year over year, given the number of replacement heifers we have available right now, just to hold it steady. I think that'll be a best case scenario for 2024, would be to not liquidate much more. And I honestly think there's a good chance we will liquidate a little bit more. Again, assuming weather's not even added into that equation. But we might set the stage in 2024 to begin rebuilding that heifer pipeline, so that we could put together at least a limited level of herd expansion, maybe in 2025. Even then, I don't think it's going to be that fast. I think it's going to take another year beyond that if we start this year and we don't have any disruptions.
And if somebody doesn't cash out when they look at a price and someone says it's time for you to be done, and that happens too.
Yeah, that comes up a lot. I get that question about age of producers and all that. And I do think it's a big issue. I mean, obviously the age demographics of the industry would suggest that we're going to see a fair amount of transition. Logically, in this kind of a market environment, some of those guys are going to take advantage of that opportunity. And all of that's very important for them, and maybe it's important in a sort of demographic sense for the industry. From a market standpoint, I'm not sure it changes things a great deal. Most of the time, most of those resources those guys are using are going to stay in the industry, and they're going to stay in production. So maybe we're changing the name on the mailbox, but I don't think for the most part that those pastures are going to go away. Now, sometimes they do, but in the total scheme of things, I think those resources probably stay in the industry. So maybe the transition adds a little more lag time in getting this thing going, with new ownership, new plans, new expectations. but I think the resources will be there, and I think we'll continue to respond to the market as best we can going forward.
We'll see how it all shakes out. I always appreciate your insight. Thank you so very much. Good to see you
Happy to
again.
do it. Yeah, you bet. It's good to visit with you.
My thanks to Derrell for his insight on the market. Recently, at the end of the Market to Market TV show, we asked you a question about some feedback, and I want to read one of the letters that we received about your favorite farm activity in winter. And it's from our friend Lee in Iowa, who says, "Dear Paul, my favorite activity in winter is checking the photos on my trail cam. I position my trail cam on the creek bridge on my farm. It's like a window into the secret nightlife of the wild critters on my farm as they saunter, swim, or fly by. The most common sightings are raccoons, pheasants, coyotes, but I see great blue herons, skunks, wood ducks, muskrats, and the white-tailed deer in the summer." You can see in those photos, it's quite active. We thank you for being active with our program. Send me an email anytime, markettomarket@iowapbs.org. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.